Hello, my name is Joe Glavin, and this is a pre-recorded presentation for the 2020 meeting of the Society for Mathematical Psychology. I will present a new method that my colleagues and I developed to replace wasteful and difficult pilot testing with an automatic procedure that controls for individual differences and makes general recognition theory experiments easier to conduct. General recognition theory, or GRT, was introduced by Ashby and Townsend to investigate different types of independence and perceptual decisions. It generalizes signal detection theory to multiple dimensions, with 2x2 designs being the most common. It has been used to study a variety of different multidimensional stimuli, whether made from the same modality or from different modalities. Recently, 2 GRT tutorial articles were published that each provide their own R package for statistical analysis. GRT proposes multiple types of independence that can arise at particular points in the perceptual decision process. The first is called perceptual independence. Perceptual independence describes the stochastic independence of the perceptual effects within a given stimulus. It can hold or fail for each stimulus, regardless of whether it holds or fails for the other stimuli. The second is called perceptual separability. Perceptual separability describes how one dimension is perceived across different levels of an alternative dimension. It can hold or fail for one dimension with respect to the other, regardless of whether it holds or fails in the opposite direction. The third is called decisional separability. Decisional separability describes the independence of the decision bound for one dimension on the level of an alternative dimension. It may hold or fail for one dimension regardless of whether it holds or fails for other dimensions. Each of these types of independence is orthogonal in theory. However, the standard GRT model cannot separately identify decisional separability from perceptual independence and perceptual separability. Therefore, in this talk, I will assume that decisional separability holds in all of my models and focus on testing for perceptual independence and perceptual separability. The usual paradigm for a GRT experiment is a factorial design. For example, let's consider contrast and shape as our dimensions of interest. For a 2x2 design, there are 4 possible stimuli shown at the right. The task is a complete identification task. One stimulus is presented on each trial, and there's one response for each possible stimulus. After the experiment, the behavioral data are aggregated in a confusion matrix so that conditional probabilities can be estimated. These probabilities enable statistical inference as well as model fitting and comparison. It is common to visualize the fitted GRT model as a equal likelihood contour map. Imagine that the sensation of each of our stimuli produces a multivariate normal distribution in perceptual space. If we take a slice through the space at some arbitrary height, it will produce an ellipse for each stimulus. These ellipses, when viewed from above, would look something like this in 2 dimensions. Now, the size of each ellipse is not important by itself. Rather, its shape and position relative to the other ellipses is what is important. For example, any correlation in an ellipse that indicates that perceptual independence has been violated for that stimulus. Here, the leftmost stimuli exhibit perceptual independence while the others do not. The marginal distributions shown in the left and bottom sides of the main graph tell us about perceptual separability. Perceptual separability holds for the first level of the x dimension with respect to the y dimension because these marginal distributions overlap. It fails for the second level because the means of these marginal distributions have shifted. Likewise, perceptual separability holds for the second level of the y dimension with respect to the x dimension, but fails for the first level because these marginal distributions have significantly different variances. Note also that in this example, the decision bounds are parallel to the coordinate axes in accordance with decisional separability. Inference in GRT is based on confusion errors, so stimuli must be carefully chosen so that a reasonable number of errors are made without making the task so difficult that participants are simply guessing. Usually, researchers will use pilot testing to determine which stimuli yield a reasonable level of accuracy, and then use that single set of stimuli for all subjects. However, the same set of stimuli will be easier or harder for different subjects. So how can we choose the right level of difficulty and equate it across subjects? We may find one answer in the psychophysics literature. In psychophysics, difficulty is controlled by specifying a model, oftentimes a sigmoidal function, to link the stimulus's physical intensity to the subject's response rate. The function may be inverted to estimate the intensity that will produce a given level of accuracy. We will utilize this approach in our adaptive experimental design. Here's how our procedure works. First, we start with a research question. How do 2 perceptual dimensions, say contrast and shape, interact? Next, we run a subject through the adaptive block, which calibrates the experiment to them. Next, we run the subject through the complete identification task and record their responses. Next, we analyze the data in R using existing statistical packages. Then, based on the conclusions of our analysis, we update our hypotheses and begin the cycle again. Notice that this is effectively the scientific method as a closed loop. Our contribution automates the final leg of the cycle, making GRT experiments much easier to run regardless of whether you're experienced with GRT or not. Last, I wish to note that the parameters estimated in the adaptive block may be stored in a database so that population-level hyperparameters can be constructed if your lab often reuses certain perceptual dimensions. The specific algorithm we use in our adaptive procedure is based on the psi method developed by Confusable and Tyler. It is a Bayesian method that produces a posterior probability distribution over the space of potential models. Priors may also be specified. Typically for psi, the measurement model is a sigmoidal function defined by its location and slope. For each trial, psi determines the probability of each response for every possible stimulus that could be presented. It then presents the stimulus that will be most informative in terms of expected entropy, and updates the posterior distribution based on the response that was made. At the end, we estimate the measurement model's parameters from the posterior. In order to use psi for our purposes, we need to use a measurement model that is more in line with the GRT model. We call that each stimulus produces a multivariate normal distribution in perceptual space, as shown at the right. To simplify the computations in the adaptive procedure, we constrain the measurement model to be as simple as possible. We assume all three types of independence and separability. This allows us to calculate the probability of each response as the product of certain combinations of cumulative density functions. Furthermore, because the measurement model assumes complete independence between dimensions, a separate psi routine may be used to calibrate each dimension in parallel. To visualize this procedure, consider the graphic at the right. The decision bounds are functionally equivalent to the psychometric function's location, and the distance between each stimulus is akin to its spread. These are in effect the parameters estimated by the measurement model. The measurement model makes many simplifying assumptions, so how robust is the adaptive procedure to the violations of its assumptions? We conducted a simulation study using a series of subject models with increasing degrees of dependence to find out. We ran each subject model through 300 trials of the adaptive process and recorded its parameter estimates. Then we repeated the adaptive process 100 times to calculate summary statistics. Before presenting the simulation results, I will first define the generalized subject model. Each stimulus is represented in perceptual space as a multivariate normal distribution described by this density function. The mean of each distribution is a linear function of the stimulus's intensity. Zeta is an indicator function that equals 1 if the stimulus is above the decision threshold on the given dimension, or -1 if it is short of the threshold. The M parameter controls the degree of mean separation and allows us to model violations of perceptual separability. If M is fixed at 0, then mean separability holds, and the mean matrix can be simplified as so. The covariance matrix is defined like this, with a standard deviation of each dimension described by another set of linear equations. The N parameter controls the degree of variance stretching and permits another way to model violations of perceptual separability. If N is fixed at 0, then variance separability holds, and the standard deviations can be simplified as so. Returning to the covariance matrix, the rho parameter controls the correlation in each distribution and allows us to model violations of perceptual independence. If rho equals 0, then perceptual independence holds, and the covariance matrix may be simplified thusly. Decision bounds are given by these linear equations. The epsilon parameters control the slope of the bounds, and if they are fixed at 0, then decisional separability holds, and the bounds may be simplified as so. Finally, the probability of each response can be found by integrating the perceptual density function over the appropriate intervals. Note that with the constraints identified previously, the parameterization of the model shown now is mathematically equivalent to the measurement model. Here I plot the adaptive processes estimates for the decision bounds for the x and y dimensions. The solid lines are averages from 100 repetitions, and the shaded areas are plus minus 1 standard deviation. Note that the procedure quickly converges within 50 to 100 trials for all subject models. However, the subject models built with a mean shift on the x dimension, here shown in red, all exhibit a bias for slightly higher thresholds. This is to be expected because the measurement model assumes perceptual separability. Here are the same graphs for the standard deviation of the perceptual distribution along each dimension. Note that for most models, the procedure converges largely within 100 to 150 trials and improves slightly with additional trials. Again, for the subject models built with a mean shift on the x dimension, shown in red, we see a now larger bias towards greater standard deviations. Curiously, the adaptive process seems to be biased in its estimated parameters only for violations of mean separability. Subject models that violate variance separability do not appear to bias the measurement model's parameters. Here I've taken the parameter estimates on each trial and found the stimuli that the measurement model predicts will yield 75% accuracy. Then I fed those stimuli to the subject models to determine what their actual accuracy would be. Note that for most models, the adaptive procedure converges on the accuracy criterion after approximately 75 to 150 trials, but it consistently underpredicts the accuracy of the subject models built to violate perceptual independence, here shown in red. This may indicate that users should target a lower accuracy when they suspect subjects may violate perceptual independence. However, the next slides will suggest that this is not necessary. Next, I simulated each subject model in 100 trials of the adaptive block, followed by 1,000 trials in the main GRT block. I repeated this 100 times and calculated the rate of significance for each statistical test. Recall that report independence informs perceptual independence and that marginal response invariance informs perceptual separability. For the fully independent model, we expect to find very few rejections of report independence or marginal response invariance. As you can see in the center of the slide, the significance rates are near the type 1 error or alpha rate. At the right, you can see that there is no evidence of correlation in the ellipses and the marginals overlap well. For the subject model built with a mean shift on the x dimension, we see high rates of rejection for marginal response invariance on the appropriate responses and few rejections elsewhere. These correspond to the differences in the marginal distributions here, caused by the shift in means here. For the subject model built with a change in variance along the y dimension, we see high rates of rejection for marginal response invariance on the appropriate responses and few rejections elsewhere. These correspond to the differences in marginal distributions here, caused by the spread here. For the subject model built with violations of both types of perceptual separability, we see high rates of rejection for marginal response invariance on the appropriate responses and few rejections elsewhere. For the subject model built with correlations in the bottom stimuli, we see high rates of rejection for report independence on the appropriate stimuli and few rejections elsewhere. For the subject model built with violations of perceptual independence and mean separability, we see high rates of rejection for report independence on the appropriate stimuli, high rates of rejection for marginal response invariance on the appropriate responses, and few rejections elsewhere. Likewise, for the subject model built with violations of perceptual independence and variance separability, we see high rates of rejection for report independence on the appropriate stimuli, high rates of rejection for marginal response invariance on the appropriate responses, and few rejections elsewhere. For the subject model built with violations of perceptual independence and both types of perceptual separability, we see high rates of rejection for report independence on the appropriate stimuli, high rates of rejection for marginal response invariance on the appropriate responses, and few rejections elsewhere. Please pause the video to compare subject models simultaneously. In summary, we developed an adaptive procedure that permits a GRT experiment to be quickly calibrated to the individual subject at the beginning of the experimental session. This allows perceptual independence and separability to be more efficiently evaluated during the main GRT study. Although the efficiency of our adaptive method is due to strong constraints we placed on the underlying measurement model, it is largely robust to violations of these assumptions. Even where the assumptions led to biased parameter estimates, the procedure was still able to recommend reasonable stimuli to use in the GRT experiment, and later statistical inference was able to recover the correct subject model. When combined with existing analysis packages, our method completes a scientific loop such that hypotheses are easily turned into experiments whose results can be readily evaluated to revise our original hypotheses. This pipeline can be used to create a testbed for rapid prototyping of human-computer interfaces.